Okay, so thanks for coming along tonight. I was thinking tonight would be good to basically cover the case for Flux and sort of explaining IBDD and things like that, because we haven't had a good explainer video since we moved to IBDD from our previous system 2 years ago. And so that's what this is about. The idea is that we want to essentially cover all the groundwork that we need to in order to understand the philosophy behind IBDD and why we think that it holds so much potential. So hopefully at the end of this I can convince you that issue-based direct democracy is a really, really good thing and that it's the future. So tonight is organized into 5 main parts. There's a little bit of an intro, and then I want to talk through a bit about democracy as it stands now and identify some of the problems, as well as to talk through some of the explanations for why those are problems. So the first part is basically the winning strategy at democracy today. The second part is about something called the Selectorate theory of political power, and that is a way of explaining the behavior of people within politics from first principles that accounts for pretty much all the bad stuff they do and why they do bad things. Then take a quick break for any questions. Then we'll look at the idea of fallibilism and consistently improving policy. You can think of this sort of like the way that science continues to improve, but we're going to look at it from a far more fundamental level. Then, if there's any more questions after that, we'll have a look at those. And finally, the last 2 sections are an economic primer, very short, just to cover enough to understand issue-based direct democracy, and then we'll get into the meat of IBDD and why it's so great. So, I guess through this journey of Flux, and a little bit before it as well, I became convinced that we were going to encounter a new model of democracy very soon. Now, it might not be IBDD, it could be something else, but this model of democracy would be so, I guess, prosperous for its people that it would be impossible not to adopt. And these are some of the properties I think it'll have. So the first is that it will bias truth instead of popularity, something that we don't do today. The second is that minorities won't need permission in order to improve their own lives. So the idea is that basically if we had a system like that, then we can scale to populations of any size, and we don't have this problem of small groups being oppressed or things like this. And finally, that it works so well that we barely even notice it. The philosophy of democracy, just from, I guess this is quite a simplification, but basically democracy is a way of making social decisions. And the problem with it, or one of the main problems with it, is that we haven't designed democracy to bias truth. It, does this weird thing called the will of the people, and it's never really well defined, but basically that's what all of our thinking about democracy has been centered around. And that means that democracy wasn't designed to make good decisions, and so we shouldn't necessarily expect that it makes good decisions. And I think that this basically, puts forward the dichotomy. Do you want a democracy that biases the will of the people, or do you want a democracy that consistently makes good decisions even if most people disagree with it? And I think these two are mutually exclusive. Either you make decisions based on the will of the people that have mistakes you could have avoided if you just had, that we already know how to avoid rather, or you make good decisions and you only make the mistakes that we don't know how to avoid. And so I think these two things, you've got to choose one or the other, or maybe there's a third option, but you can't have both. The designers of democracy up till now, I think they've made 2 very broad mistakes. And those mistakes are disregarding the mechanics of power within a democracy. This is power as it works universally, and then disregarding the role of new knowledge in prosperity, progress, and policy. These are, as you may have guessed, our next 2 topics, but we'll take a bit of a detour just first. So the first thing is how to win at democracy. This is a very simple scenario. We've just got 3 people, they all want a particular democracy or a particular policy. We're going to look at direct democracy just to keep things simple, but you can extrapolate this to any sort of democracy. And our 3 people in this case are Alice, Bob, and Charlie. Alice wants all cars to be yellow, Bob doesn't want any cars to be yellow, and Charlie just really hates clogs. Now Charlie is a bit of a practical guy, and he thinks if I don't make a deal, if I don't swap my votes with other people, then I can't be sure my policy is going to pass. However, if I can create a sort of alliance with someone and they vote for my thing and I vote for theirs, then I can ensure that my policy passes. And because I don't care about cars, I may as well go with that. So here's Alice, Bob, and Charlie. Charlie says, hey, does anyone want to trade votes? You vote for my policy and I'll vote for yours. Alice is quite moral in this case and just thinks that's outright wrong. But Charlie says, yeah, okay, we'll do it. Now, as you may guess, this is how the first ballot goes, where 2/3 vote for no cars being yellow. And as you may also have guessed, in this case, clogs are now banned, which maybe is okay. But the problem here is not that clogs are banned, the problem is that every other decision is also going to be split into 2/3 and 1/3. And what happened here was that basically Bob and Charlie just invented a political party and they permanently excluded Alice, and they now have exclusive power. So notice here that nowhere in any of this have we actually talked about what's right or wrong or good or bad or anything else. All we've talked about is just the dynamics of what does someone who wants something to happen do in a democracy. And what we learn is that basically the biggest strategy, the optimum strategy, is to be the biggest group. This isn't that surprising. We work in a majoritarian system now and things like that. You want a majority because you want to pass your policy. The other 2 points here is that there's no penalty for corruption at any stage. There's no negative for Bob and Charlie making this alliance. And there's no opportunity cost between issues. Neither of them had any loss from the way that they participated with each other. It was, in fact, they only had gains. And so what we've got now is that we've got a system that doesn't penalize bad behavior at all. And we're going to come back to the idea of opportunity cost later on when we get into the economic stuff. So, what's the evil here? What's the part of this that was, what part of this caused the problem that we saw? Because it wasn't, the people's policy they wanted. It wasn't that money was in politics. Whatever happened here, it was quite pure and core to our previous ideas of democracy. And so my suspicion is that basically static majoritarianism is the biggest evil in democracy. The idea of having one party or one group have a majority on every issue, and we can't do anything until, say another 3 or 4 years when we have another election and things like that. And so that's, in my opinion, is the biggest evil in democracy. Now, generally speaking, majoritarianism suppresses criticism. It's based around the idea of exclusion, and it makes the suggestion of new ideas an exclusive privilege. Now, if we wanted a system that selected good ideas, these seem like bad things to have. I've included this slide mostly for the liquid democracy part, but basically all of representative democracy, direct democracy, liquid democracy, they're all static majoritarianism. Liquid democracy has a little bit of, I guess, an upper hand because you could redelegate during a period, but basically you end up with a set of voters, they vote the same way the entire time, and you can't do anything about it. So if we want to solve this problem, we're not going to be able to look at all the old ways of doing democracy. We're going to have to come up with something new because we're not going to find new solutions in old answers. So what do we do about it? So there are 2 parts to understanding this. First is power and the second is knowledge. Power because obviously it plays a big role in politics, and knowledge because we're concerned with good policy. So part 2 is about the Selectorate theory. There's an excellent summary on YouTube called Rules for Rulers by a guy called CGP Grey. It's about 20 minutes long, highly recommended. So what we're going to look at is how power acts on rulers. So opposed to how rulers use power, just what effect does having power have on a ruler. So congratulations, you are our volunteer, and you're the new monarch or overlord or dictator or all that sort of stuff. And here's you and here's your cake. Congratulations. Now, your first goal as Supreme Overlord is to keep being Supreme Overlord, because obviously if you don't do that, then you will have nothing and you will be able to change nothing, and it'll all be a waste of time. And because you're an overlord and not a prime minister, you'll probably end up dead, which is bad. So the problems that you have is that in order to keep staying Supreme Overlord, you've got to do a lot of stuff, but you can't do that alone. You need allies. And the only advantage that you have there is that you control the treasure. How much this is, maybe it's oil fields if you're a dictator, whatever. But the treasure, that's yours to control. And so the first rule is you need to get the key supporters on your side. No man rules alone, and you need someone to build roads and hospitals and oil fields and manage the police and the military and things like that. So you need to find key supporters. And you'll probably find them, where they're waiting for you after they deposed whoever was your predecessor. So without them, without your key supporters or keys, you can't do anything. You're not going to be. They will if you don't satisfy them, then they're just going to replace you. So what you need to do then is basically to maintain the keys, acquire the keys, and what you need to do that with is the treasure. So the second rule is controlling the treasure. Is only you can raise the treasure through tax or theft or whatever else, and you need to pay that in part to your keys to keep them loyal. And then you can use your keys to raise more treasure, and this cycle continues. But this is basically if you had a dictatorship based on gold, this is basically the structure. You've got someone to mine gold, someone to wield the guns, and that's it. And then they just keep cycling like that. So the problem here is that if you control the treasure, you attract rivals. If you had the idea at this point that, okay, I've got this big trove of treasure and I want to do something nice with it, like build schools or roads or hospitals and things like that, the problem is that you're not spending it on your keys. And the problem with not spending it on your keys is that someone else can come along and basically say, talking to the key, I'll give you more treasure if you swap sides and you support me in the upcoming coup. And so if we're talking about dictatorships in this sort of position, then they are required, it doesn't matter how pure of heart the person is, they are required to spend money in this way in order to stay in power. Because again, if they don't stay in power, then someone more tyrannical will come and take it from them. And so basically you're forced to do this. There's no way out of it. The other problem is that all of your key supporters have the same problem, is that you are their income and they have to redistribute their treasure to their supporters. And so on, down, all the way down the line. Peasants are, off to the side here somewhere. They're not part of this graph. But because being a key to power is a position of power, you've got the same problem that any person in a position of power has. And so you're incentivized to raise as much treasure as you can, which means you're incentivized to support the leader who's going to pay you as much treasure as they will. And so you can't spend it altruistically. You're still forced into the same thing. And we have this all the way down the power graph. We have this same phenomenon. Now, if you have too many keys, then as you might acquire over time, the problem is that you're giving less treasure to each key. And if you wanted to maximize loyalty, splitting the treasure up a lot isn't a good plan. So the only option is to eliminate the keys that aren't useful. In a dictatorship, maybe you kill them, maybe you're nice and you just exile them or something like that. So rule 3 is you need to minimize your keys. You need as few key supporters as possible, you need them to be as loyal as possible, and that's what makes it as difficult as possible for someone else to come and take power from you. So just to recap, coups for dummies. Is your dictator weak and are you in a position of power? Then you might be interested in a coup. Step 1, promise all the key supporters more treasure if they support you. Step 2, use their power to overthrow the dictator. Step 3, eliminate the useless keys, even if they supported you. And this is basically the recipe for every coup. This is why revolutionaries who take power end up turning on their comrades who supported them and end up allying themselves with some of the key supporters of the old dictator and so on and so on. You can't get out of this cycle for the reasons we've already talked about. If you try to be altruistic and spend it on all nice stuff, then someone else is just going to take that back from you. So the moral of the story here is that power requires corruption. Is that you cannot have power without being corrupt for all of these reasons. But you might think democracy offers a way out. However, democracies are really not that different. So you still need key supporters. In the case of you being a leader of a party, that would be other MPs. You'll need groups of citizens to get you elected. Highly influential people like Richard Murdoch can definitely, Rupert Murdoch can, throw some bones your way. And basically, you need to maintain your key supporters in the same fashion. The other things you can do is make it harder for other people's key supporters to vote. You can make it easier to win elections by changing the electoral system. You can gerrymander and draw favourable electoral boundaries. You can ensure that your party has complex pre-selection protocols so that you're always the candidate, things like that. And so you can use the same tactics and the same sorts of rewards in the same way to remain in power. Now, to touch on the idea of the Selectorate, the groups that you need to convince to support you, they're called the Selectorate. And so it's a combination, it's a smaller part of the electorate. You can approximate it with swing voters, but it might be a bit larger or smaller. And basically, if 40% of the people always vote left and 40% always vote right, then there's no incentive to offer them anything. And all of the treasure that you have access to, you can offer to these swing voters to get them to vote for you and continue to win elections and so on. So satisfying keys in a democracy is pretty straightforward. Although you can't give them bribes or eliminate people, you can give them favorable legislation, you can give them tax loopholes, give them get-out-of-jail-free cards, especially if they're a banker, and you can give them business contracts. You might be creative and come up with other ways as well. The problem here is that if you don't do these things, then whoever your competitors are, who are willing to do these things, will, for the same reasons we covered before, start winning the electorates that you were winning, and then you won't be able to do anything because you'll lose your power. And so again, even in a democracy, we still see that corruption is a tool that's required. So to stay in power, use corruption as a tool. And your authority is too good of a gift to waste. Basically, corruption is enabled by authority. It's the power of decision-making and the power of wielding, the instrument of the state that allows corruption to take place. And the problem with representation is that representation necessarily equals that authority. Is that if you win that election, then you have that authority. If you're on the winning team of, out of the factions that try and wield policy or wield authority called political parties, then, you can start doing a lot of stuff. And so democracy is by no means immune to any of the things that we've just talked about. And as we can see here, the problem, at the end of the day, is the problem of authority. Corruption is just the manifestation of authority. So, to end corruption, you must end authority. However, in a dictatorship, treasure comes from theft or resources. In a democracy, treasure comes from the voters. So the rulers of a democracy need to keep their society productive. Unlike the rulers of a dictatorship, who can go around and kill people or steal all this stuff, you need to keep your society productive in a democracy, and that means that you need hospitals and roads and schools and education and the rest of it. So we have more of an advantage here. Just to illustrate this loop quickly, if we start with productive society, that leads to specialization and more keys through either industry or other things like that. That would lead to an unstable dictatorship, which then leads to democracy and then leads to higher productivity. But the thing here is that none of this starts with democracy, it starts with productivity. And only through being very productive, such that being a dictator would destroy that means of raising treasure, can we actually get to a democracy. So it's no use going into a dictatorship, killing everyone, and putting in a democracy if you haven't solved any of the underlying issues, like being productive. So we're getting close to the end of this section. Basically, this, I think, labels everything as it stands so far. So dictatorships on the left have very few key supporters. They're unstable. When they're far left, they're stable. Then we have this period of instability. And then we have democracy as we know it with many keys. And I definitely feel like, in the West at least, we're heading further and further towards this next unstable period. Satisfaction with democracy is the lowest it's ever been. And maybe there's something beyond that. And maybe we're just going through, like we went through the previous transition long ago, or some people are going through now, we'll go through another transition shortly. So I have a hypothesis here, which is mostly because it's pretty cool and it's actually testable. I'm not sure if anyone's done any research on it, but the hypothesis is that the political system that eventually dominates is the one that's able to support the most key supporters, and to enable the most specialized society and the most productive society, essentially. Now, I think this lines up with a lot of intuition, makes a lot of sense. Whether it plays out or not, we shall see. So, first little intermission. If anyone wants to grab a drink or anything, now's the time. But if you have questions on that last section with Selectorate theory, yeah.
Well, I probably will grab a drink in a second. But to pose a question, for the sake of question's sake, and I just because I'm a critic and I'm always looking at a point of criticism, but how do we, the word productivity, I guess, is a word that I'm a bit afraid of and afraid to use, and particularly when we're looking at an unstable environment. Are you looking at trying to create a stability, or trying to more so allow instability to be present and thus kind of be more stability than a utopian system that was pursuing that?
So, well, I guess we're not aiming to create stability at all. Rather, this is more just an explanation about what happens between dictatorships and democracies and how that transition takes place. In terms of the productivity side, I think it's okay to use words like that, and I use words like progress and prosperity and good and bad and things like that as well throughout the presentation. The reason that it's okay to use productivity is because basically anything that you can leverage and extract value from falls under that. And so we don't have to explicitly define it in terms of like, GDP or particular like production output from manufacturing or anything else like that. It doesn't matter what it is as long as you can tax it.
Yeah, it's about creating a space for that diversity in terms of...
Well, essentially, if you were interested in producing democracies, then you definitely want to create that space.
Yeah.
You'd want to create a vast diversity of industries, and you want to make sure that they have enough business to sustain themselves, and that's sort of the recipes that allow I guess a stable democracy, maybe not a prosperous democracy, but at least a stable democracy to arise.
It's quite historically clear cut that democracies arise where there's a relatively educated population, where countries that are at the leading edge of production and all that. That's why Karl Marx always said communism will happen in the wealthiest countries, not in the backward countries like Russia, China, and so on. Anyway.
But yeah, no, it's also interesting, I think, to note, it's like there's plenty of examples around the world at the moment of democracies where they're not as industrialized as the West, that consistently have problems. So Brazil is not a bad example. Iraq is definitely an easy example. And I think that sort of plays to the point that you're always going to have instability until you reach that level where you have enough key supporters that stability is necessary. And so you sort of have this chicken and egg thing as you build up the case economically.
My question,
Yep.
move on, is you mentioned satisfying keys as corruption. In normal political language, we talk about that as meeting the needs of swinging voters. Why is that corrupt?
So I guess the reason I use the word corruption here is because it doesn't actually, well, your concern is not whether a policy is good or bad or not. Your concern is just offering something in exchange for political support. And if you quantify that in terms of money, then it would definitely be corruption. If you were to pass like outspokenly favorable legislation for them, then that would be seen as corruption. Whereas, when you bring in a particular scheme with enough sort of thing, it's like, it's a bit sidelined. And we don't talk about, corruption as much. But it does the same, it has the same function. Now, I guess the problem here is that whether it's a good policy or not doesn't come into it at all. It's more about offering something in exchange for support. And I guess that at a fundamental level is the problem. Democracy doesn't work, so we can argue that, or doesn't work particularly well, so we can argue that, maybe this is just the way that, progress expresses itself. But I think we're sort of skirting around the issue, and if we look at it in terms of corruption, then we get a lot more of an insight into the behavior of politicians, as well as the nature of the problem.
And separate issue, just a more fundamental issue, I think, at the beginning, we're probably going to see questions arise in the future about the kind of technocratic way you've talked about decisions that are correct decisions versus decisions that majority.
Well, so, particularly in the beginning, I was basically, so I'm not saying that any decisions are better or worse than others, just that there are better and worse decisions. Now, I also don't claim to know what those decisions are, and I do claim that it's impossible to make progress without making mistakes. And so, in terms of, I'm actually very anti-technocratic because I see that as being basically another form of authoritarianism, and you still shut down criticism, you still make suggesting new ideas and exclusive privilege and everything like that, so I think a lot of the same problems come out. I do see where you're coming from, though. But basically that was a shortcut to...
Sure. Yeah. Might be that there's some modification to the language that will alarm people less and make people less fearful that what you're talking about is some kind of Marxist-style idea of there is something scientifically correct, a political decision that is scientifically correct versus a political decision that is not scientifically correct. Of course, it's all to some extent.
Yeah. Well, I do claim that you can tell good policy from bad policy, as we're about to find out, but that you can't tell which out of two good policies is correct without trying them, essentially. Is that once you have two good policies there, you've already established that they don't conflict with available evidence, or at least that the amount they conflict is basically on par with one another if you had two options.
Bringing it down to policies is already bringing it down to a technocratic level. I'm talking about you can only think about what's a good policy and what's a bad policy if you're clear in your mind about what you want to achieve. And
yes. Oh yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, there is such a thing as a conflict in values that are maybe unresolvable between two people and so on.
Yes. No. Oh, definitely. But I think so. On the note of values, I basically take the position that everyone's values are wrong in some way and can be improved in some way. If they're not, then I mean, good luck to you. But basically, we've always got improvement, and that's one of the key underlying values here. And that because there's like if we do have conflict, then it indicates that there is something wrong with at least one of those things that's in conflict. Because the universe doesn't conflict with itself; it doesn't spontaneously explode. And so fundamentally, at a fundamental level, if you're I mean, we'll get into it, but if what you're suggesting, like if you make a conjecture and it agrees with reality, then you shouldn't see certain types of conflicts, essentially. So, but anyway, let's get into the philosophy side. So part 3 is knowledge and policy, and most of this is based on ideas put forward in The Beginning of Infinity by David Deutsch. If you listen to anything else that I've talked about, I pretty much always mention that book. So, highly recommended. So democracy has this poisonous question, which is who should rule? And it's poisonous for many reasons, but to cut to the chase, basically it's asking what is the authoritative source of good policy? This is essentially the same question as what is the authoritative source of knowledge. The problem the problem with that is that if there was an authoritative source of knowledge, they would need to be able to explain why they're the authoritative source of knowledge, and if they did that by just saying, because I say so, that's not any good. And if they have an actual explanation, then it depends on something else outside of them, and so they can't be the authoritative source of knowledge. So basically, this question is fundamentally flawed at a philosophical level, because there cannot be any authoritative source for good policy or knowledge or good explanations or things like that. We're always going to have to have new ideas coming forward. So as I just covered, there is no authority on knowledge. And in order to understand basically the who should rule question and understand it deeply as to why it's flawed, then we need to understand the idea of knowledge. And knowledge, at least in this case, is made up of explanations about reality. Now, you might say, there's knowledge like the sky is blue, which is fair, that's just, sort of standalone fact. But to actually understand why the sky is blue, I need, the ideas of Rayleigh scattering and the way that light refracts through the atmosphere and things like that. And then you might say, I guess only with that complete explanation behind it am I actually convinced that the sky won't become red tomorrow, or that if it does become red, it's probably because it's evening and the light is going through more atmosphere and things like that. And so what matters here is that fundamentally behind things like that is that there is an explanation that makes a claim about reality, and particularly because it makes a claim about reality, if it's right, it lets us manipulate reality. Good example, if I have a theory about how to make cars that involves toothpicks and bubblegum, then my car is probably going to fall apart, where if I have some nice material science and understand combustion and things like that, then I can actually make something that goes somewhere. So explanations can be good or bad. As a sort of a subtle point here, correct explanations are always good, but incorrect explanations are not always bad. Now, we're going to drill into this idea of good and bad just now, because it actually has a rather specific meaning, and that when I talk about good policy and bad policy, I'm not talking about what's beneficial to me or what I agree with. I'm actually talking about something far more fundamental. So if we have a look to start with at a bad explanation. This is the Persephone myth. It comes from, highly modified from Greek mythology. And the idea is that Persephone is a goddess of spring or something or other, and that when she visits the surface of the earth, then it's nice and warm and sunny, and we have spring and summer. And then when she goes to the underworld, it's cold and it's autumn and winter. And then she just does this on a 6-month cycle. Now, the thing about this is that this is a testable theory. It makes a real prediction about the world, and I mean, in fact, we know that this theory is disproven by evidence. So this theory is testable, and because we have different seasons in the different hemispheres, we know that this theory is incorrect. We also know the correct theory, and that adds a bit more. But the problem with just saying, the seasons are different in each hemisphere, is that we can easily then extend this to just changing the theory to account for this new evidence. And so we create a second Persephone myth, where it's, Persephone actually travels around the globe, maybe in a polar fashion, taking a year to go all the way around, and when she's in the northern hemisphere, it's warm and sunny, and the other hemisphere is cold and drab. And the thing is, this is still testable, it's still explanatory, it matches all the evidence we have, but we also know that it's nonsense. And so what we can take away from this is that testable explanatory theories can be nonsense. That's like, there's nothing to say that they can't. Now, if we have a look at the true theory of, or well, at least the truer theory of seasons, then this is the axial tilt theory. Probably all encountered it early in high school science. And the idea is that the Earth is, tilted off axis, and so during the, I guess, Australia's winter, the northern hemisphere is facing the sun more, and so receives more of the sun's light, and the southern hemisphere receives less of the sun's light, and therefore the northern hemisphere is warmer and the southern hemisphere is colder. And then as we rotate around to the other side of the sun, our axis tilt is still in the same direction, but now the southern hemisphere is pointing towards it, and so the southern hemisphere heats up, northern hemisphere gets cold. Now, the important thing about this theory is that if we changed any of these details, then the theory breaks, because it is highly interconnected with a lot of other theories. It's connected to the theory of gravity, we've got geometry, we've got things like spinning spheres in a vacuum, maintain the point that they're pointed towards along the axis of rotation, things like that. And so if anything else about the world weren't right, or we changed anything about this theory, then it would immediately fall apart. And more to the point, we can't change anything about this theory without breaking it. So the conclusion here is that good explanations are hard to vary, is that for an explanation to be good, it has to be hard to vary, and if an explanation is bad, it means that it's easy to vary, like the Persephone myth. So the way that we get to good explanations is that firstly, someone needs to provide that explanation as a conjecture. They just have to say, this might be the way the world works. And we then filter out all the bad explanations via criticisms. We can also filter out, a good explanation that disagrees with evidence is not that good, so we can filter those out via criticism. We can also criticize, very sloppy explanations and things like that. And at the end of that, if we can conject and criticize in a sort of cycle, then we end up with a process for spitting out the good explanations. Is that just every possible idea we stick in, we put it through this process of conjecture and criticism, and out comes, or if it comes out, then it's a good explanation. This is basically the way that science works, through a peer review cycle and things like that. The other thing about good explanations is that they're unpredictable. The first point is that if we could predict good explanations, then the discovery of that prediction would entail every other explanation within it, and so you could never actually predict anything because it is the discovery itself. Good explanations also still need to be tested. Just because they're good explanations, just because they're hard to vary, doesn't mean that they're correct. Newton's theory of gravity is an easy example. For 300 years we thought it was correct. Einstein came along and was like, lol, no. So good explanations still need to be tested, and they can still disagree with reality. In fact, I would argue that every explanation disagrees with reality, and we just continually approach more and more correct explanations. The other thing is that they're typically unintuitive. The universe doesn't care about human intuition. There's no reason to expect that it is somehow arranged in a way that's easiest for us to understand. And additionally, if they were intuitive, then it'd be easier to predict and suggest some kind of other underlying structure to it, which itself we would expect to be unintuitive, because otherwise you'd have to explain intuition in an intuitive way, which sounds counterintuitive. So basically, the last point here is that unintuitive also means that it's likely to be surprising. Where it's okay. In fact, we should expect to be regularly surprised if we're creating new knowledge, because if we weren't surprised, then we basically would have already known it. So the moral here is, don't dismiss an explanation because it's unintuitive. We need to substantially criticize it. So in the last parts of this chapter, I want to touch on a few other topics, because while they're not as directly relevant, they're very interesting, and they give us a very good context for looking at the systems we're going to be creating. And so the first is the principle of optimism. And basically the way we construct this is we start with, for any given potential solution to a problem, there's only two possible outcomes, or classes of outcomes. And the first is that if it breaks the laws of physics, then it's impossible. And the second, that if it doesn't break the laws of physics, then it is possible. And so what that means is that if a solution is possible, because basically all we're doing is mutating the state of the universe from one state to another. Even if we're talking about a problem like refugees, then it's still a matter of the arrangement of atoms at a fundamental level. At least in this case, we won't find an explanation at that level. But basically what this means is that if there is a solution, then it's only a matter of having the right knowledge, basically knowing how to manipulate the world around you to produce that solution. And if that's the case, then we have this amazing conclusion that all evils are due to a lack of knowledge. Provided that there's no law of physics that says that humans have to suffer for some reason, which seems like an odd law to have, every political problem, social problem, energy problem, everything else like that is basically due to us not knowing how to solve it. Not because it's physically impossible. None of these problems are, like I said, there's no law of physics that means we have to have problems. It's just that we don't know how to solve them. And so if we want our political system to solve problems, it therefore has to focus on creating new knowledge, because that's the thing. The lack of that new knowledge is what's causing the problems in the first place. Now, if we link this back to policy quickly, policy is essentially an explanation about some phenomena plus the environment that we find ourselves in, and that leads to a behavioral change or an economic change or whatever else. But basically it leads to a change in our situation such that we solve our problem. And what that means is that good policy has to rely on good explanations. And so good policy has to be hard to vary. Because if policy was easy to vary, it would indicate that it probably isn't correct, it probably doesn't do what it predicts, and we shouldn't expect it to actually benefit us. And so this criterion of good policy that relies on good explanations, I think is quite fundamental. And without good explanations, how could we ever construct policy that actually does what we want? So the conclusion here is that all political problems are soluble, which just means they can be solved, and that we also need a system designed to create knowledge. And if we don't have that, then we shouldn't expect that we can solve those problems easily. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but that we can't solve it easily. And some more conclusions. Basically, the who should rule question should be changed into a form more like, how do we best create and implement new knowledge? Or perhaps the alternative put forward by Karl Popper, which is, how do we best detect and eliminate errors without violence? Or how do we best detect and eliminate bad rulers without violence? And so basically, the who should rule question starts from a point of authority. It invites authoritative answers. It invites the idea of violence. Because if you're not doing, if it's a grave, evil not to be doing the divine way of doing it or whatever else. And so these two questions here, the latter two questions, are far more productive in terms of actually producing a political system that we want to live under. So that's the end of the part 3. So, yeah? All right, we can just skip. That's, yeah, sweet. Okay, final stretch, economics primer. So, markets. Markets aren't inherently good or bad. They're just a tool. Like hammers, you can use hammers to do great evil, or you can use them to build a house. So markets just redistribute resources. That's all they do. They can be bad. So in an example where one actor controls 90% of the supply, that generally leads to worse results. But they can also be good, because you can trade things that you have for things that you want, and that probably improves your life. So markets, they're a tool. Specialization in trade. So basically this is, if you had to narrow down 3 words that explain most of the prosperity of the world, and couldn't talk about new knowledge, then specialization in trade is what it is. Trade allows people to specialize in the first case. If you don't have that, then you have to live in sort of like a subsistence lifestyle. But once you can trade, you can start specializing and start making really good axes, and the person over there makes really good coats, and then you trade, and now you've got really good coats and really good axes instead of having crap coats and crap axes. And so by doing one thing well and letting everyone else do the things we do badly, but they do them well, we basically produce prosperity. That's the early stages of prosperity. Even if the knowledge is still the same, then we increase our prosperity via this way. Furthermore, specialized individuals have more knowledge and a higher capacity to be useful. I think that's fairly obvious. So the next, I think this is the last part, opportunity cost. So basically it means that if we do option A, then we have the cost of not being able to do option B. And the presence of opportunity cost incentivizes specialization, because if you have the opportunity to do, or rather, if there is a cost for not specializing, for say spending half your day growing bananas and half your day catching fish, you're probably not going to do as much as if you spent your entire day growing bananas or your entire day catching fish. And so this idea of opportunity cost means that it's worthwhile specializing, provided you don't specialize in areas that are over-specialized already. More specialization means that we end up with more and varied supply of various goods in the market, and this increases the opportunity cost of not specializing because other people do the things you do much better than you when they do specialize. And so we've got this system, this opportunity cost that begets specialization, and then specialization trade begets more opportunity cost. There's also another term called comparative advantage, or another economic, mechanic called comparative advantage that plays a role, but it's not necessary to understand issue-based direct democracy, which is our next and final part. So, IBDD. Basically, it's a new system of democracy. I invented it about 18 months ago. It's been evolving since then, and the core element of it is to design, is to bias knowledge. So there are 4 key components. Specialization, and the main reason for this is that knowledge is lumpy in society, is that I know how to do tech stuff fairly well, but I know nothing about running hospitals or health policy or education policy. And so if we're going to produce the most from our set of participants, we need to specialize. The other 3 parts, so trade, that sort of comes into specialization quite a lot, that links quite strongly. And then we have conjecture and criticism, which, as we've discussed, is necessary for the creation of new knowledge. Now, it's not that these things don't exist in our existing political systems. They do. We have ministers with various portfolios, various parties, especially with parties in the balance of power, will trade power to get various legislation through. People put forward bills all the time. There's plenty of conjecture, and if you've ever watched Question Time, there's plenty of criticism as well. But what we haven't done is we haven't optimized for these things. We haven't said, okay, this is what we want, and we want to produce a system that does this best. Right? It's more like these things exist in our previous systems by accident rather than because we've deliberately designed them to. So, broad overview of IBDD. So the first thing is that everyone gets an equal footing. And the reason this is important is that the source of new knowledge is unpredictable. And so by excluding anyone, then we exclude a possible source of new knowledge, and that is ultimately to the detriment of our political system. Anyone can suggest legislation pretty much at any time. It won't be entirely any time, but regular opportunities like every week. That's our conjecture part. Anyone can vote on any legislation, which is our criticism part. So the problem that we have is that, if we look at this, everyone on an even footing, anyone can suggest legislation, anyone can vote on any legislation. Direct democracy can do that. So what's the actual thing that we need here? And we need to weigh different conjectures and criticisms, which is part of specialization, and we need to weigh that in order to produce the best results. Now, the other thing is that we need to do that without authority. If we created someone in a position who just said, okay, you get to vote on that and you get to vote on that, then essentially we've just moved the problem around. And we don't want that. We want to be able to do this without authority. So, for any economists, you've probably guessed that the answer is markets. The core idea behind the construction of IBDD is to use a market to trade votes on different issues. So the other way that this manifests is you can think of it as creating opportunity cost between issues. There was a quote that we came up with during the WA election, which I quite like, which is basically that Flux and IBDD make the back room the front room and everyone's invited. And so it's not that, the problem with the idea of backroom deals is not that deals are being made, it's that everyone else is excluded from that, and it becomes an exclusive thing. And that's, by keeping people out, that's the evil. So what we do as well is all units are distributed as evenly as possible. That keeps us egalitarian. And I hypothesize that IBDD is more consistent for various community groups or politically interested organizations than representative democracy, provided that they have good policy. So the way that we set up the market is there are 2 types of tokens. There are votes and political capital, which I also call liquidity tokens. As you might guess, political capital exists basically only to trade between votes. So all votes can be traded for political capital while the issue is live, which might be, say, a month. The rate is going to depend on supply and demand. It's not one-to-one at all. So very unpopular issues, you won't get much political capital for. Very popular issues, you get a lot of political capital for. And this is where you get elements like opportunity cost and comparative advantage, incentivizing many people moving out of popular issues that they don't really care about too much because they can do so much more with that political capital in other issues. So obviously political capital can be traded for votes as well. And political capital can be used to suggest new legislation. So there's opportunity cost between suggesting legislation and voting on legislation. And finally, anyone can suggest new legislation very regularly. So when an issue is proposed, each voter receives one vote. By default, if they don't use it, then it's put up into the auction system. Now, the reason for this is basically that otherwise we would need to, do one thing for every issue, which would basically be as difficult as voting on it, which would be silly. But also, it means that if you don't participate, you actually acquire essentially a stash of political capital. And so even if you're politically apathetic now, if you become part of this system, then you end up with a stash waiting for you as soon as you try to come back, which is basically, your reward for giving everyone else more political power because you didn't involve yourself during that period. More market details. So political capital is constantly redistributed via a basic income style. The way that we do that is basically we use inflation to create new liquidity tokens, and this acts like a sort of universal tax. Because we're redistributing back to everyone, if you started with, say there was 100 voters and you started with 1% of the share of political capital, you would have 1% at the end as well. But if you were a big, say you'd hoarded a lot, then that will push your stack down. And so it constantly pushes us towards an equilibrium. So by doing this, we maintain an egalitarian system. It incentivizes people acting earlier rather than later, and this sort of tax hits hoarders the strongest. And so it consistently pushes us towards this equilibrium. And then as a final detail, there's an onboarding bonus. So when everyone signs up, they get X amount of tokens, and basically that's to get you started. So some properties and predictions. So the first property is that any policy can be challenged at any time, and because of this, because of this also has a cost, I predict that good policies will persist and bad policies will be challenged. This is because bad policies, because they either benefit one group above other groups, or because they act unpredictably, are a target for being challenged. Whereas if a policy doesn't really harm anyone and does its job, then there's no reason that you'd want to change it. This equilibrium means that the most efficient way to express yourself politically is through the proposal of new policy, or voting on good policy. Is if you're going to focus on putting forward policy that's bad, then when you suggest that, or let's look at the next slide, if you do try and put forward bad policy, then it's going to be challenged because it's either going to harm someone or it's going to act unpredictably or something else like that. In order to push that policy through, you need to then spend more political capital to get your required votes to reach a majority to push the policy through. And you're going to have to keep spending that because other people are going to, after that policy passes, if you manage to get it passed, then other people are going to think that, still want to take it down. And so when you put forward bad policy, you don't get a free pass like in our government today, where if they put forward a bad policy, nothing happens for 3 years, and then maybe it doesn't happen for another 3 years because they won the election again. Whereas under IBDD, that consistently is challenged. And so if people put forward bad policy, that is not just a negative on their political capital then, it continues to be a negative for as long as, or drawing down on that, for as long as they remain staunch in their protection of that policy. So basically this costs you the opportunity to produce good and enduring policy. However, if you put forward a good policy, then it acts as predicted, it doesn't harm people, and it's not going to be a priority to change. This also means it's going to be easier to defend. It also means that no one's going to try and fight you when you're establishing that policy, or at least if they do, then it'll be to a lesser degree. And so you need to expend less political capital to get it passed, you need to expend less political capital to have it maintained, and these things start to, even though everyone in this system is on the same footing, it means that we can create this divergence between good and bad policy such that we start biasing that better policy. The way I like to think of this, or one of the approximations for thinking about this, is the idea of betting on which options are best. If you lose, then you just lose all your political capital or the amount you chose to bet, and you don't get anything back. Whereas if you win, you still lose your political capital, but at least you get the policy passed. And so that's sort of the rough, the economic way that I like to think about it. So IBDD means that there is no permanent government or authority, and that changes issue by issue. And I think that's very important. We add in delegation for efficiency, and this basically lets our communities come together as well. And the end result is that we end up with issue-based politics, which is very difficult to do otherwise. It's highly autonomous for political communities, and it makes it much easier to introduce good policy. So I wanted to focus a little bit on the idea of specialization in IBDD with communities and causes. So when you have the ability to delegate, it means that you can pass some or all, maybe in proportion, so 70% of your political capital, through to someone who has the time and energy to really drive a particular policy or a group of policies forward. Many examples here, so Indigenous leaders, scientists, community leaders, whether that's like your school or your church group or anything like that, other political parties even, NGOs, industry groups, all of that sort of thing. Basically anything that you can think of, you can delegate in this system and let someone else pick up that work for you. Of course, if they end up behaving badly in your eyes, then you can just undelegate straight away as well. Because typical communities end up caring about a few issues very deeply, they're incentivized to trade away all of their other issues. So say they only care about 3% of the issues that come forward, and so if they can trade away 97%, then that allows them to really maximize that 3% into something that's really substantial. And basically this allows them to have political autonomy. And so, they don't need the permission from the majority in order to institute policy they perceive as good to them and that doesn't affect other people. And so, particularly if we're talking about federal politics, then I see this as a massive, massive advantage. Political autonomy for communities means that we can satisfy more communities than the existing political systems. It's just that getting started is the hardest part. Actually getting people elected and getting people onboarded and using the system in a meaningful way is the hard part. But if we can pull this off, it means that we, as Flux, end up attracting more and more key supporters. And so we have all the recipes here for starting to get a snowball rolling that really can't be stopped, provided that IBDD acts as I predict. So, summing up with a range of properties and qualities. So, it breaks majoritarianism. It's a highly dynamic voting system which changes with every issue. It allows for more key supporters because political autonomy allows them, essentially you don't have to team up with someone, and because you don't have to team up with someone, they're not going to cut you out when you become useless. It removes the idea of static authority. No one ends up with a unilateral say on what can or cannot pass or cannot be suggested. And if they are going to defend bad ideas to attempt to stop some group participating, then it costs them political capital. And so basically we've made being corrupt in the old way, or in some of the old way, a very expensive idea and one that is self-defeating. So we actually have a really a strong negative feedback loop when it comes to that sort of corruption. We have an opportunity cost for bad behavior, quite related to the last point. So oppressing a community creates laws that are beneficial, or creating laws that are beneficial for yourself reduces your political potential because other people are going to fight you on it. It incentivizes specialization. The path to maximizing output is to suggest good policies and to specialize. It incentivizes education, something that a lot of other systems of democracy struggle with because voters usually aren't that important, whereas here, because there's actual real potential through trading votes to specialize in one particular issue, because there's real potential to actually change legislation, that if you want to actually go after an issue, then you, by educating yourself, that's a high yield investment. Is that really pays off in this case, whereas in direct democracy or representative democracy, it really doesn't pay off 99% of the time. IBDD also produces good policy. So the best strategy for passing policy is to make it as robust as possible against criticism and base it on the best explanations that you can find. It increases prosperity for all, and the reason I say for all here is because people are treated equally and can participate on the issues they choose to the degree they choose to, producing policies that actively reduce one group's prosperity is very, very, very difficult. And a policy that increases prosperity overall obviously gets them, and there can be specific ones as well. And as long as they don't harm people, then it should be easy to pass. It allows for change with minimal effort. And so due to the opportunity cost of fighting against good policy, which, I mean, basically if you think something's good policy, you're throwing money down the drain by fighting it, unless you really had it out for the other group. We have a system where new ideas should be able to bubble up with, at least with far less effort than representative democracy or direct democracy, and hopefully with minimal effort, though we might be able to make more improvements. So to sum up, I think IBDD is the first of these sorts of systems. I don't think it's the only way of doing it, but basically systems that bias knowledge and have some sort of way of, without making judgments about people or their intentions or things like that, to create a system that produces progress. There's an honourable mention here to quadratic voting, which I think took some steps but didn't quite go far enough in terms of the philosophy and other elements of construction. Particularly as well, IBDD requires diverse creative input. And if we end up with a system of censorship or judgment based around that, then we're naturally going to limit the capacity of issue-based direct democracy. And so it's nice that it's I guess, compatible with our intuitions about the ways that things should be. And then also, it works because it treats policy as an ecosystem, not in isolation. And that is very different to pretty much every other system of democracy out there, which doesn't behave differently if you have one issue on its own or one issue in a big group of other issues. With the exception of political parties and major blocs and things like that, we treat policy as an ecosystem, and that's one of the things that allows us to really extract value from it. So thank you for sitting with me through that. If there's any final questions, let's have them now.
I'd like to hear you explain the relationship between IBDD, Flux, and the software you're developing.
Okay, yeah. So issue-based direct democracy, to start with, is just the system of democracy. So you can comparable to the Westminster system or direct democracy or whatever else, just a protocol for voting. Flux is the political vehicle to get that protocol into Parliament, I guess the short way. The long way being, change the constitution or do all kinds of this sort of thing. And then the software that we're developing is the way that Flux actually interacts with the voters and what implements issue-based direct democracy and takes it from theoretical to practical.
Sure.
And so those are that sort of trio is yeah.
So IBDD is dependent on the software?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So for this sort of system, because it's highly dynamic, theoretically you could maybe run small democracies via paper, but realistically it would rapidly grow to be untenable, especially if we're talking about involving, say, 20 million people or 200 million people.
Yeah.
Whereas as soon as you involve software, as long as you can make your software secure, then we can scale to hundreds, thousands, millions, billions of people without too much of an issue. I guess that's another thing that I didn't quite cover in here is that theoretically, if everything acts as I predict, then it's not like there's an upper limit on this. It's not like our traditional democracies where, as the population grows, you either need to add more representatives or the each person's individual representation is diluted. In this system, because it would be rational to predict that if the population grows and specialization also grows, then we should actually see all of that room open up and fit people in. And so we have a system that doesn't become more stagnant the larger it gets. And I think that's one of the other problems with representative democracy, and one of the reasons it's so difficult to change, is that when you grow to be hundreds of millions of voters large, then convincing all of them is a very, very difficult proposition. And likewise, you end up with very, very entrenched status quo that really prevents progress. Cool.
Question from the live chat.
Oh, yeah?
So I think you've already explained it, but could you explain briefly, basically, why is Flux not a direct democracy?
A pure direct democracy? So I guess because pure direct democracy, should I look at the camera for this one? Because pure direct democracy doesn't bias knowledge. It doesn't have a system or a set of systems set up to push us forward to create new knowledge to actually solve problems. It's essentially just a codification of populism. And populism is not something that we should expect to produce good decisions. So I'm not sure if I can easily go back to way back here. Whereabouts was it? So I talk, like back here, I talk about the idea of do you want a democracy that biases the will of the people, or do you want a democracy that consistently makes good decisions even if most people disagree with it? And I guess what this comes down to is in the second case, our system of democracy would avoid mistakes that we knew how to avoid. Whereas when we're talking about the will of the people, there's no reason besides either maybe common sense or that the knowledge of the issue is sufficiently spread throughout society. There's no reason that it would produce a good result. Now, particularly, there's plenty of examples where the popular answer is maybe not the best answer. And while we can't always make a judgment about whether an idea is good or bad, sometimes we definitely can, but most of the time we're not going to be able to. What we find is that because we're not biasing knowledge, we're going to make mistakes that we knew how to avoid, or at least that someone knew how to avoid. And so direct democracy is necessarily suboptimal. It necessarily performs worse in this particular way of measuring it than alternate systems that bias better ideas rather than, or better constructed ideas is maybe the better way to put it, rather than direct democracy, which doesn't have, it doesn't really link up with the idea of well-constructed ideas or badly constructed ideas or anything else. It's just a measure of popularity. And so so we weren't satisfied with that. We didn't think that it would solve the political problems that we've set out to solve. And so we created a solution that we thought would. Cool.
And another question that comes up quite a lot, and will come up here again, is tyranny of the majority. How are the minorities going to be protected under a system? So,
well, I guess I think IBDD deals with that in a much better way than every other system out there. There's no protection for minorities in the Westminster system or the Washington system or direct democracy or liquid democracy or anything else. The reason that IBDD can be more beneficial to them is because for other people to oppress them, those other people need to basically accept an opportunity cost. They need to accept that they're not going to have more power elsewhere in areas they really care about. And the minority now has the capacity to put 100% of their political capital towards fighting the oppressors. So if we're talking about a situation where just unilaterally 75% of all people want to kill the other 25%, then no system of democracy is going to protect you there. That's a far more fundamental moral issue than democracy. Democracy is sort of like, okay, we've gotten over wanting to just unilaterally murder a quarter of our population. Now we're into actual collective decision making and figure out how we can do that. So once we go past that step, then I think issue-based direct democracy, it's not that it provides explicit protections for minorities better than other democracies, remembering as well that other democracies don't provide any protection, but it at least gives minorities the chance to be sovereign most of the time, to be self-deterministic, to actually make their own decisions, and it also gives them the chance to really fight back if someone or another group really tries to hassle them. And so I think that, in terms of if you were someone in a minority and you were concerned about political oppression, then I think a system like IBDD has a lot more to offer than pretty much every other system out there.
And on the flip side, what stops minorities from gaining a lot of political capital and using it to press their own agenda?
Well, they can if they want. It's just that you've got to accept that the majority might be unhappy about that. They will probably see that as detrimental to them. If they see it as detrimental enough to justify action, then they're going to either compete for the votes on the issue when it arises, or they'll just suggest that we undo that legislation as soon as it passes. So, big fat cat bankers or something say, oh, we're gonna tax the poor, just 50% tax the poor or something like that. They might be able to push it through once, but then if people then suggest to undo that legislation, then they have to continue fighting against it, and they have to spend all of their political capital trying to keep a group oppressed instead of actually being, productive when it comes to their political expression. And additionally, those people they're oppressing, they're not going to stop, right? As in, the most important thing to them in their life right then is solving that issue. Whereas unless that's true for our fat cat bankers in this case, unless that's also true for the fat cat bankers, then they basically have no choice but to give up the game. They've got to go focus on actually being productive and nice to people for a change. And so, I don't think minority rule, I think, is far less of a risk in IBDD than it is in our traditional system. We definitely have what amounts to a minority rule system at the moment, which just in terms of the demographics of representatives shows. And so in terms of minority rule, I think IBDD deals with it far better than our existing systems. And in terms of majority rule, then because we have this idea of specialization, we prevent the tyranny of the majority as well. Now, it's not unilateral, it's not perfect, but I think it does a hell of a lot better than our current systems.
And I think it's relating to the screen here, but the question is, how are you defining good?
So I talk about this much later on. I'm going to have to go down here. So good is, so it's not a word that I'm just using arbitrarily. I am actually focusing on a very specific aspect, and that is that when I'm talking about explanations of policy that is good, I'm talking about explanations of policy that are hard to vary. Now, this is for reasons that relate to reality. So we have, a myth about the seasons to do with the god Persephone, going from the underworld to the overworld and things like that. And we realized that it would cause the seasons to be the same. So the people just change the theory, and instead she goes around the planet. And so the reason that this theory is bad, the fact that it invokes a supreme being just for the sake of it is not great either. But the thing that makes this theory bad is that we can alter it to fit the evidence, regardless of what that evidence is. And so we started from this first theory, which there's the claims on the left. We started from this first theory, and then we just changed it because the evidence disagreed. And so if you can change things arbitrarily and they're easy to vary, then they cannot correlate with reality. Now, being hard to vary doesn't mean that it's correct, but it is the biggest hurdle for an explanation to get over. Because being hard to vary means that if anything about reality were different, or if you changed anything about the explanation or the theory, then it would break. And so we want our policies to have the same qualities. If we make a policy to address a particular issue, then we want to make sure that if evidence disagrees with it, there's no way to just quickly patch up that policy and keep going, because it's likely that we're just going to find more evidence that disagrees with it, and we can continue this patching process infinitely without getting anywhere. And so if we're looking for a better political system, we have to look for a political system that produces policy that's hard to vary, and then once we realize it's wrong, it's like, okay, we can move on. We have to come up with a completely new explanation, a completely new policy. And so that's what I mean when I talk about good and bad policy, good and bad explanations. I'm talking about this quality here, hard to vary.
And lastly,
cool.
Summarize IBDD in 2 sentences.
IBDD is a democracy that lets people participate how they want, when they want, and to boot produces much better policy than usual democracy. It means we have to worry less and we get better results. That's the summary. I can't summarize the explanation in 2 sentences, it's a bit deeper, but in terms of the effects, that's it. Is that, yeah. Cool. All right, sweet. Well, thank you for everyone who joined us online, and thank you for joining us here. Yeah, I guess that wraps us up for tonight, so thank you.